Right. Welcome. Looks like we have a full house tonight. So first and foremost, welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And also, I'd like to welcome the PACS and SSIR contingency. We have a pretty large group tonight, and hopefully over the course of the evening, you'll have an opportunity to get to meet some of them. So first, I'd like to start with Wubzena Jafar in the back, who's really the program manager who is responsible for this event. Thank you. Additionally, Jackie Huddle outside the door, Annie Rohan next to the door, Priya Shankar, who just walked in the door. Additionally, we have Laura Seaman, there you are, from our Digital Civil Society Lab, Nadia Romani from our Effective Philanthropy Lab, Paul Brest, right there, faculty director, and Michael Voss, our new SSIR publisher, right back there in the back. So welcome. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you'll have a moment this evening to actually connect with one of our team members. So we'd very much like that. We like to know who's in the audience and get to know you better. Additionally, let's start to dig in with the topic. When are big bets the right bets? So with the rise of these large, visible announcements and proclamations, such as the New Yorker has written about Mark Zuckerberg and philanthrocapitalism, or Laureen Powell Jobs and her $50 million announcement for super schools, there are many questions for all of us to consider and to ponder. So welcome to what we hope will be a really provocative evening tonight. So with that, we will actually be live streaming the discussion. So when we get into the Q&A, we'll ask that all of you actually use the mic so that those on the other end, who we also welcome, can hear all the questions. So thank you for that. So now let me introduce our panelists. We have William Foster, who is the Bridgespan partner and head of the consulting practice, an active thought leader on issues of philanthropy and social change. He has a particular focus on diligence, structuring, and supports the philanthropic Big Bets work. William has helped Blue Meridian, the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a number of individual donors to craft some of the sector's largest gifts. At the end of 2016, William collaborated with Forbes to publish its first ever Big Bets for Social Change. In November of 2015, he published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, Making Big Bets for Social Change, this article on the cover of this particular issue of SSIR. So, William, here you go. Why don't you join us up here? Next, we have Larry Kramer, who's president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And Larry became president of the foundation in 2012. Before joining the foundation, he was professor of law and dean of Stanford Law School. During his tenure, he pioneered multidisciplinary legal services and studies, enlarged the clinical education program, revamped various programs to foster a public service ethos, and developed the International Law Program to support a growing emphasis on globalization in legal practice. Larry serves on the board of a number of nonprofits, including the Climate Works Foundation, the National Constitution Center, and Independent Sector. Today, SSIR launched our latest issue, which includes Larry's article, Big Bets for Social Change. So on your chair, you have this new issue, and on page 61, you actually have the Big Bets article.
I think the title's
Right
actually
there.
a little bit different.
Against Big Bets. Thank you. Thank you, William, for that correction and edit.
There was an earlier piece.
Exactly, exactly. And then finally, but you each have that issue, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Alexa Cortez Colwell, and she is the co-founder of Open Impact, a strategic advisory firm partnering with social change leaders to envision, design, and accelerate their impact. She is the co-author of the Valley's new The Giving Code, and the Giving Code looks at Silicon Valley's new wealth, their giving, and this new ethos of big bets. For nearly 2 decades, Alexa managed and built foundations, philanthropic initiatives, and strategic grants for social entrepreneurs. For 12 years, she served as president of the Charles and Helen Schwab Foundation, and then for another 5 years, she served as president of the Larry Stupsky Foundation. So with that, please join me in welcoming Alexa, who will moderate the panel. Thank you.
I think I want to sit on the end. Yeah. So thank you, Kim, and thank you to the Stanford PACS team, and mostly thank you to all of you. You bring the energy to this discussion, and we're going to be turning to you for questions and answers, response, discussion in probably about 50 minutes. We're going to have a lively discussion up here, and then I'll open it up, and we'll have about half an hour to hear from all of you. So begin thinking and preparing your thoughts. I know from being at these events in the past, you have no problem doing that, and we'll probably be competing for the microphone. And we want to welcome the live stream audience as well. It's great to see Stanford PACS extending these events well beyond the doors of Stanford, especially when it's hard to park on campus. So there may be people who actually are live streaming instead of actually being here because of that. So I want to start with just a few framing remarks before we kind of turn it over to Larry and William to really get into this discussion of big bets and philanthropy. Kim mentioned that my firm has just come out with a report that I co-authored on Silicon Valley nonprofits and philanthropy. And some of the context I want to provide is also based on what we found about this local place we're sitting in. So we know nationally that we're in an era of unprecedented accumulation of wealth. And in Silicon Valley, we have this hyperactive economy, hyperactive accumulation of wealth. In the Giving Code, we actually quantify that there are 76,000 millionaires and billionaires with $1 million in investable assets, not excluding the value of one's home, in just Santa Clara and San Mateo County. So we have an extraordinary accumulation of wealth here. And like the rest of the country, we actually see philanthropy growing across all segments. So that's happening across the country, but in Silicon Valley in particular, our individual giving is growing. We're outpacing our peers nationally and in the rest of the state. But nationwide, there has been a nice markup in individual philanthropy. Private foundations with assets over $10 million are being founded and growing at an unprecedented rate. There's more foundation giving going on in the US and also here in Silicon Valley. And then this thing called donor-advised funds is probably the most remarkable trend. An astounding amount of accounts are being created for donors when they have a wealth event to have a very specific, quick way to make a donation, get a tax deduction, and then make their giving decisions over time. And I bet there's a bunch of donor-advised fund holders right in this room. And we know just here in Silicon Valley, the 3 top providers of donor-advised funds have about $9 billion in assets that they're holding across several thousand accounts. So philanthropy is growing. There's no doubt about that. With it, our social problems are scaling, and yet our solutions don't seem to be scaling as fast as the problems themselves. And we have money sitting in certain places, and then we've got all these problems over here. And I think we're all kind of grappling with how do you better connect and create a more efficient system for getting the capital connected to the need and then smartly deployed to actually create impact and change in people's lives. So that's the conversation that I think sets the context for then this really interesting piece that William and his colleagues have put together called Big Bets. And what the format we're going to do is I'm going to have William kind of introduce this article, give us some of the key takeaways. Larry then, in the subsequent issue of SSIR, has just published an article called Against Big Bets. And we're going to just kind of get into it. We're going to get into this idea. I mean, personally, I just want people betting on social change in particular. I don't really care if it's $1 or 10 million or $1 billion. I just like to see more money flowing to this issue. What we're finding, the big aha across several reports that have come out this year, both Williams, the one I've written, and one by the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy, is that when you look at where this money is going, it's actually not making its way to the important issues and causes of our day. It's mostly going to what donors consider safe and familiar, and it's going to institutions. There's nothing wrong with that kind of philanthropy, but you wonder why there couldn't be an and proposition where people would both be supporting those kinds of institutions and the places that have benefited them, and also expanding that. to include the least among us, underserved communities, and issues of social justice. So that's where we're really now segueing to this report that you've written based on really interesting research, where among the really interesting kind of data points is that in 2015, you were able to identify 58 big bets of $25 million or above going to social change causes. And that seems, given all the accumulation of wealth and philanthropy, that seems pretty small. And so tell us kind of where you went from there.
Yeah, happy to do it. And Alexa, thank you for taking the time. And Larry, it's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about this. So I'll give you just a few words on the basic notion of big bets and where our research came from. And like a lot of things, it came from some element of personal experience. So as Kim mentioned in the introduction, I have the privilege of working with philanthropists and nonprofits to hopefully help them achieve more good things in the world. And about a dozen years ago, I worked with this organization in Memphis called Youth Villages. Some of you may know of it, most probably don't. But Youth Villages is one of the most effective organizations working with kids in the foster care system or at risk of getting put into state custody. And a dozen years ago, they were in Memphis and a little bit of West Tennessee beyond that. And what their innovation was that they worked with kids more intensively in the home. And that got better results and cost less, actually, than having kids taken out of the home. But they were a small organization getting by with a very viable government revenue stream, but without much flexible money beyond that. And this philanthropy, called Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, discovered them literally through secondary sourcing kind of desk research, and ended up meeting them, doing a fair amount of diligence, crafting a thoughtful grant, and with an 8-figure gift, helped transform their ambitions. And today, the organization's in 13 states, is probably the most influential organization shaping the way child welfare systems work. So I saw this, and it was remarkable what that flexible money would do. And by the way, it wasn't all that big a percent of their revenue. I mean, government revenue was still dominant, but that flexible money unleashed a ton of potential. And so colleagues and I looked around and said, why aren't there more things like this out there in the sector? What's going on? And we did this research. And I think we found two important things in this research to start as the overview. The first was that there was actually a very strong pattern of very important social movements, nonprofit organizations being fueled to their success by big bets, having some type of $10 million plus, that was our research base, bet helping them achieve what they have. So the 911 phone system, vaccinations in the developing world, the charter school movement, marriage equality in more recent decades, the civil rights movement in the 60s, specific nonprofits like City or Environmental Defense Fund, KIP. All of these things had a philanthropist at some point, generally after a bunch of work, put a fair amount of money on the table to empower and entrust the leaders of that to achieve something big. And we saw this pattern. Unfortunately, there's no list of the highest impact nonprofit movements or organizations in the world, but we looked at many lists, including your partner Heather's list of nonprofit organizations. And what we found was somewhere between 70 and 90% of what are viewed as the most successful nonprofit movements and organizations had a big bet. But then when you look at, we took a sample of all human service organizations that were large, 10 million in revenue or more per year, and only 2% of them had ever received a philanthropic bet. So we saw this pattern of big bets playing a role in driving and fueling important successes.
William, before you move on, can you just break down, like, what is a big bet? So it's somebody who comes in and gives some kind of transformational amount of money, and is that the definition?
Yeah, and I'll give you two definitions. The one was for our research because we needed to do something, and we looked at a $10 million figure. We looked at all U.S. donors that gave a $10 million grant to one or multiple organizations in a set.
Not quite. If they announced it. Right?
So
there are lots and lots of organizations giving away $10 million or more towards something that they see as a single thing. You guys could only pick them up if they had some kind of announcement that we're putting 10, 20, 30, whatever it is, into something.
So we did a few things. We looked at all public announcements. We looked at, for all of the largest foundations, their 990s. And for the ones that had patterns of big betting, we followed up and asked for follow-up information. So So we did, but it's not perfect, right? It's not perfect. But this was the database that we used, right? So could the number, for all human service organizations be 3% or 4%? Maybe. But there was this clear differentiation between very successful nonprofit and movements and the broader sector, where in the broader sector, gifts of $10 million are exceptionally rare. So to give you a sense, in contrast to the wealth that you cited, Alexa, when you take out major university traditional gifts, cultural institutions, medical research, which kind of are the big institutional giving, and look at everything else for social change, from the Boy Scouts to the environment to religious institutions to whatever, there were identifiably 67 gifts a year of $10 million or more each year over a 13-year time period to that. Now it's growing in recent years, but not very many. And so we said, why is it so rare if it seems to be correlated or have a pattern with success? And what we found was that there's a big aspiration gap. It's not that there's not money. It's not that there's not money being given away. And it's not, in fact, that the biggest donors want to give to the toughest type of social problems. Looking at all of the biggest donors, individual donors and institutional donors in the country, when you look at what their missions say they want to do, when you look at what they hold up as their proudest grants, the emblematic of why they do this work, the vast majority want to focus on tough social problems. It's not a rare thing at all. But when you look at where the money goes, 80% of the $10 million plus gifts go to traditional university giving, medical institutions, and cultural institutions. So only 20% go to these very tough social problems. And in the end, Alexa, we think there's two things behind that. One are some mindset barriers that are important to consider and address. It is perceived by donors to be vastly riskier to give to these kinds of problems than to your 25th reunion class gift at your alma mater. It just is. You catch a lot more flack in the media for it. And then the second has to do on the nonprofit side of the equation. There just aren't that many nonprofit leaders that have a $10 million, $50 million, $100 million plan that's ready. There aren't shovel-ready plans. I mean, if you were to go to the development office, probably within half a mile here on campus, and say, I have $50 million for you, I suspect there would be things ready to go. And if you didn't like those...
I think there's someone in the audience who's specifically in charge of that.
So in fact, the person may be here to talk to. And I suspect if you didn't like any of the things that were ready to go within a week, you could have some other ideas. Now, if you want to help Syrian refugees, or you want to help inner city kids in Detroit, there's no drawer full of ideas like that. And there just aren't the shovel-ready projects. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. It would be foolish for a nonprofit leader or social movement leader to spend a ton of time thinking about what they could do with $50 million because it happens so rarely.
Yeah.
And so that essentially gets at the essence of why we've done this research and why we did collaborate with Forbes for that
Yeah,
for that
so now
piece.
we're going to get into the
So-
Forbes issue. So I think before we do that, should we have, so tell quickly, so now you collaborate with Forbes to create a list, a ranking of these gifts.
Yeah,
that right?
and so I'll just give 2 words on that, and then maybe Larry can have a chance to jump in here. But for us, it comes down to these 2 barriers, right? There's the mindset and the shovel-ready projects. And on the mindset, what is it that would allow the world and philanthropists to feel more confident and safer scaling up their giving to bigger amounts? By the way, 10 million is not a magic number. 9 is great too. You just need something for research purposes. But what would allow them to do it? And on the mindset, the thing that we believe most is it's about peer examples, right? Why is it normative to give large gifts to your alma mater? You see your peers do it, you have a relationship with it. The more you can feel comfortable and familiar seeing what your peers do and seeing their example, and maybe even calling them up and learning from them, the more we hope that what's currently abnormal behavior will become normal behavior.
All right, so Larry, so now they've created a rank. So now Forbes is going to be publishing. Is this going to be a regular occurrence by Forbes that they'll do their very Forbes thing, which is provide the wealthiest Americans list, the most generous philanthropists list, and now they're going to provide a list of the biggest bets?
Well, they've signed up for a 2nd year, so.
Okay.
Oh, that's so bad.
I know.
I know you think so. I know you
all
think
right,
so.
So now we've got a ranking of the big betters, and Larry's now got a rebuttal.
Okay, so there's a lot to say, but I'll make 2 points. So one goes to the methodological problem, which I actually think is really profound and leads to the second one, which is what really drove me, which is the perception problem that is created by this framing. So the methodological problem is really pretty simple, which is, so I'll just take our foundation as an example, okay? We got picked up in their list with having one big bet, which was one large grant to European Climate Foundation for like $33 million.
So you are on the big bets list.
Well, we were on the
Forbes.
the Forbes secondary list. They had a top 10, and then they had 48 other contenders. And we were in
Okay.
there. But
On the
believe
list.
me, I was not insulted by that. I would have rather been left out altogether. I'll come back to the problem with lists. But this first point is, if you actually know anything about the Hewlett Foundation, and what I'm going to say about the Hewlett Foundation is indeed true for every single large staffed foundation, and most of the major people that I know who do this, who actually have the capacity to give $10 million out. And that is, in fact, we have 5 programs. Each program has 2 strategies, plus we have several initiatives. Every single one of those counts as a big bet by this definition, in the sense that we have made commitments of far more than $10 million towards achieving a particular social goal which we have defined. What we haven't done is make a big announcement at the front end that we're committing X dollars to achieve some particular end. We just developed our strategy and we go about executing it. And the execution of it, because most of them involve really complex social problems, they're not solved by giving a big grant to a single organization. They're solved by many, many small grants. We do tend to do about 2/3 of our grants as general operating support, about a third as project support. But either form, they're not, any individual grant is not a huge grant, but the framing of it, our conception of it, what we're after is in fact exactly what this is supposed to be about. It gets missed precisely because of the framing. And the framing becomes a problem for me because what actually, and this is not, I don't think, when Bridgespan published her article, I didn't like immediately sit down and want to write against big bets. It was the Forbes thing that put me over the top because what I think the Forbes thing does is it reflects the way what Bridgespan did is actually being understood and absorbed. And if you read it, you see it. That is to say, what really good philanthropy is putting a huge amount of money into a short-term, disruptive is the word we get all the time, effort to solve a social problem in short order. And every single one of those features is reflected in the way they think about it. And to my mind, there are occasional things that can be addressed that way, but they're pretty rare. Really good philanthropy doesn't start that way. Really good philanthropy starts with what's the problem, and then what's the best way to solve it. And as I say, occasionally it might be like there's an organization that can do it. We're actually a participant in Blue Meridian and supporting youth villages, because that does seem to us to have some potential for a certain set of organizations and a certain set of problems. But the vast bulk of our work is, say, take climate change, right? Now, you want to talk about bets, right? Or fixing Congress. There's a bet. Most people think it's a ridiculous
Larry,
bet.
can you just quickly give us a sense of the scale of the budgets for some of these programs? I mean, you have $9 or $10 billion in assets, and you're spending out 5%.
Yeah, well, but so there's the annual budget, and then there's the cumulative budget. So take conservation. Our conservation program is about $20 million a year, but it's every year. And we're in it for the long run. We've been doing it since 1969, making steady progress against what is a really difficult problem. Climate is $100 million a year, but it doesn't go out. It used to go out as $100 million to ClimateWorks, which then was the re-granter. Now we've taken that in, and it goes out as many, many small grants and a handful of actually really big ones. Education, we have 2 different strategies, one around open educational resources. That's about, I think, $12 million a year, one around what we call deeper learning, which is an effort to change the way in which teaching takes place in schools. That's around $30 million every single year, and so on. And as I say, that is the way every single one of the large foundations works. They have strategies, they have social goals that they're trying to achieve, but they understand that they're in it for the long haul, and they're doing it through the accumulation of many small efforts. Again, not always. There are things that work the other way. But as I say, for me, the fear is now you've got all these new people coming into philanthropy, and the message that they're getting over and over again is if you want to be cool, if you want to get written up in Forbes. So I hate rankings, because I was a law school dean, and I suffered through rankings. No, and the problem with rankings is you end up having to fetishize whatever it is the person developed because you care about being on it, right? Then you end up having to fetishize whatever it is the person putting together the ranking is going to count. And so what's the message that Forbes is sending? Give a lot of money to a single organization for a short-term solution that you can call disruptive. And I hate the disruptive thing. I'd love to talk about that. We'll do that later,
All
I
right,
guess.
so let's bring William back.
So let
now
me
we're
just
gonna
jump in here, because there are many things we agree upon.
Most.
But I want to focus on the ones we don't. But in part, what I want to focus on is, does big bets actually encourage what you're afraid of, right? So this notion of short-term, quick win, magic bullet, disruptive. It's certainly not what I think is good philanthropy. And I don't actually think that's what any of the big bet writing has encouraged. And in fact, even in the Forbes article, which is the one that catches your attention the most, none of those things are quick. It never says anything about quick. It never says anything about one grant to one organization. In fact, when you look at what are the organizations that were highlighted, it's the Bloomberg Foundation's multifaceted initiative to reduce, to close down coal plants that are creating a disproportionate amount of emissions. Number of Gates grants are there. The majority on the list are in fact going to multiple grantees. And I'll come back to what actually...
Let me just jump in on that one point, which is sort of true and not. The only thing I'd say is read them and see what you think, because it's true, none of them says this is what must be. But in fact, if you read the text, that is what they're tending to emphasize, and then there's a qualifier where there are some other things. And if you scrutinize the list, it is true that they don't all fit that. But the language, this at least is the way it reads to me. But read them yourself.
Right,
I quoted
so
a lot of the language in my article.
And then I'll come back to this point about, our lists and ranks sort of tyrannical, right? And I haven't lived as a law school dean managing a law school and how its ranks are, so I don't have that background. But what I guess I would say is that right now, philanthropy is one of the few places in society that doesn't have market forces on it, right? At Bridgespan we talk about excellence being self-imposed in philanthropy, and it's true, because it's self-imposed. So and I think there's a tremendous amount that's good in civil society about philanthropy being enormously free. So, is a little bit of a ranking a good thing or a bad thing? I guess what I would encourage you to follow up on is read what the criteria are. It isn't, I want to do the quickest thing, and that's what's going to get me the attention. The criteria are things like having a clear pathway for achieving the result you state with the money you're putting in. Having philanthropy actually be a lever that is distinctive in achieving that goal. Having a high-quality relationship with the grantee or grantees, and having learning built in. These are four of the criteria. So I guess
You're talking about the Bridgespan article now, right?
No, that's in the Forbes. And it's specifically listed in the Forbes magazine as the criteria that inform things. So I guess my view would be is if a bunch of philanthropists obsessed about that and tried to max out on it, we should be so lucky.
So what I'd say is, first of all, if that's actually it, then the vast majority of the givers who are capable of doing that are actually doing it. It's not getting picked up because they haven't been, although this is encouraging them to begin, worrying as much about the announcement as anything else. And I do think that is absolutely part of what's... So what I would say is, in addition to looking at these articles, look at the coverage of them. Read what David Callahan has to say about this stuff in Inside Philanthropy. Read what the Chronicle says. And what you see is, overwhelmingly, this is the message that's getting created. To me, it's of a piece with a larger set of faddishness that's running through philanthropy today, that's all around this philanthrocapitalism stuff, and there's some notion that traditional philanthropy was failing, so the one thing we don't want to do is all of those things, which I think of as good traditional philanthropy, and we have to find new tools and gadgets. And so MacArthur comes out with its $100 million to a single organization or an idea that's going to change a major social problem, and increasingly the new philanthropy people, what they're... And this is from conversations, I don't mean to, if you're listening, I don't mean to be overly insulting, but it's the thinking about the announcement is a huge piece of what they're doing. It's like, you shouldn't actually need to do an announcement at all. You should just do the work, but it won't get picked up then, and you won't get covered in the New York Times reports. And I do think that is a very big piece of what is being sold here, whether intended or not. I said in my piece, I don't think it's the intention, but I find it hard to look at what's happening in philanthropy and not see that as a big piece of what's...
So one thing it seems important to do is to begin to segment all the different groups that might be big bettors and how they would approach that. So one is, you're in a very elite group of the largest private foundations in the US. You sit at the very top of that list, even though I know you don't like
Increasingly low.
Yeah, you've got new arrivers, but you're in that kind of top 10 echelon of the top private foundations in the country, one of the largest payout foundations. So you've got a way of looking at big bets, which you just described rather, very eloquently. Then there's kind of another segment of foundations that are coming on board, which are being watched, which are these kind of $10 million in assets and more, right? So these are organizations that don't have the wherewithal of the Hewlett Foundation or the Ford Foundation, but they're looking to make an impact and they're trying to figure out how to do that. So what advice would you have based on what you've learned on what it actually takes to drive change? Because I think that's where we are in clear agreement is, both of you are really committed to creating impact in the world. I think there's nothing to argue about that. And all the work that you're doing is in service of that goal. You could try to argue that. You could argue what the metrics are, what you would take as sufficient evidence. So if there are donors in this room, nonprofit leaders, people who are holding DAFs right now that have accumulated assets for philanthropy, what are the lessons or takeaways from this debate that you think are really salient to a new donor who is trying to figure out how to have an impact? And this aspiration gap seems really important, right? That I'm aspiring to do something, but I have no idea how to actually allocate my dollars to do that in a meaningful way. And there's certain things that come at me and seem really safe and easy, and I do it out of gratitude and out of tribute to my alumni organization. But how do I actually maybe create change on something that I'm mulling over but just don't know how to get started?
Sure. I guess I'd probably offer 3 pieces of advice to the person. One is hold true to the notion of what you actually want to give to, and don't let the more sophisticated, larger institutions that come at you change that, right? I've spoken with donors who are on sort of the later stages of their giving life, who are frankly wistful, where they look back and say, gosh, I've had all of this wealth in life, and now at age 70, I look back and say, what has it gone to? And the vast majority hasn't gone to what actually motivates me to be a giver in the first place. So one is stay true to that. The second is to give over a long period of time to a number of initiatives, organizations, leaders in the field creating social change. And then the third part is, and learn from that where you can step up in a really big way. One of the things that our data shows is that, in fact, big bettors, all of the people that have given these larger grants from the database that we built, actually have a pattern of giving 4 gifts before their big gift, over years, many years, 4 distinct gifts, and that then the biggest one is a 10x step up over the largest prior gift. And that strikes me actually as a pretty healthy pattern of give, 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 and then when you have a certain degree of confidence in something, give it a much larger way.
Make a bet.
Yeah. And I think that can be true. What's big to you is what's big to you, right?
Yeah. So I agree with 2.5 of those, and then would add 1. Well, no. So it's important. So the first one I think is the most important, right? Which is you should give to what you really care about. It has to come from passion. So I think that's really critical. And then, patience, right? So it's not. It's learn, dig in, try stuff, make adaptations from that. So that's the point about being willing to go slow. Even more so, by the way, if you're a $10 million foundation, so you're only giving out, say, what is that, $500,000 a year, all the more so, right? You need to then be really, you're not going to do something in a one fell swoop. You've got to think about what you can move and how you can move pieces slowly. The piece I would, sometimes give, and then give a lot. And sometimes that's not going to be the right thing to do. It's going to be actually just continue giving. And maybe spread it out differently, maybe concentrate it a little. We do see in our own work that we'll start more with project grants as we get to know grantees and understand the field. And as we realize the alignment will shift, not necessarily in the size of the grants, but to general operating support, because we're more aligned and we understand and they understand what we're all trying to do together. So, and it might grow, it might get to be a smaller number, but it's let the goals drive the form of the giving, and don't start with any preconceptions. And then the only thing that I would add is collaborate, right? Just find, and that, if you ask me what the big problem, a lot of what we've just described in Big Bets, the article wouldn't have been a big deal if it really just did all that, because I'll just do a shout out. That's what Paul wrote 10, 15 years ago. That's what, right? Money well spent, that's what that book is about, on how to do this. So I do think this is after something different. It is after a change. It's after, big bang. bam, things, and that's really not how social change takes place often. So, and collaboration becomes key precisely because it's so hard. And as I say, if you ask me what's most missing in our sector, it's that. People do too little of it.
So can we talk a little bit about the PR aspect? So a lot of people would say that publicity is really about being a leader, signaling to others the importance of an issue, that a lot of times donors actually work more anonymously, and that works against an issue. And issues need light shone on them. They need donors who are respected by their peer groups to step up and make the case and, you know, compel other donors in. And so I think there could be a compelling reason to make announcements, to do PR, and I know Hewlett maintains a pretty quiet profile, but it may be asserting its influence in other ways. So I just want to push a little bit on that, because it does seem that the trend toward anonymity, which is also the biggest argument against donor advised funds, right? We don't know who these donors are, we don't know what they're giving to, we can't trace it, you know, is one of the arguments. So that seems to be a little more.
Yeah,
of a
but
gray
there's,
area.
I'm not in favor of anonymity. I don't think big announcements are necessary to do any of the things that you said. So we will promote our grantees and their work. We'll certainly talk to any funder. It's not like the people who are capable of stepping up don't know what we're doing, and if they don't, it's easy enough. We spend a lot of time, because of the collaboration goal, doing outreach to all the other potential funders out there. And on the flip side, I actually don't think that the big announcements, like, there's a whole lot of people like, oh my God, I never thought that was a problem. I now feel inspired to go do that. I just don't think that happens from the New York Times or Forbes. I do think it can happen, and maybe that helps some, but there are so many other ways to do it that don't come with the cost that I think does impose when people begin. I have a line in the article that the big bet phenomenon begins to feel like it's more about the philanthropist than it is about the philanthropy. And I do, you know, and
Yeah, go ahead.
And I guess what I would do, so I think sometimes the philanthropy can be helpful to their grantees with publicity and sometimes not. I think it completely depends, and ought to be done thoughtfully. I actually think the most important things about big bets is exactly the opposite on the publicity front, which is it's not making the hero of the philanthropist. It's making the hero of what the bet is and what it goes to. Because right now, the vast majority of press on philanthropy is not about the works, right? It's about the personalities of the givers and how much they're giving and how much they've pledged. And absent actually having clear bets that are being placed that become more well-known, nothing will replace it. So if a big giver creates a foundation with tons of money and does a lot of small things, and there aren't clear things they're on the hook for, the work doesn't become the center of it. So I actually think that one of the things that's really important in our next chapter is that we make the work the focus of the attention, and that people are on the hook for success or failure a little bit with those bets.
I wish that were so. I wish I believed that. All the coverage of Blue Meridian has actually been about Blue Meridian and EMC. Very little about the work that it's doing. The Forbes list is all about the philanthropists, although yes, they mention the work they're doing. I wish, it'd be like people are competing to get on the Forbes lists. Why? And so I just as a practical matter, I just think it's really, I'm with you on what the goal ought to be.
So I want to throw in some research that goes against what you just said, William, which is many of you might have read in Sunday's New York Times new research on philanthropy. Here was the title of the article in the op-ed section: How to Get the Wealthy to Donate. It's easy. Just cater to their sense of being the heroes of their own lives. It goes on to articulate in studies that they've done of donors that donors will respond to asks where they get to be the hero versus joining a collective issue or cause. So it specifically actually, it reveals the opposite of what you just said. As much as I want to believe in what you said and would definitely advocate that position, it ends up that donors actually do want to be the center, and they find a lot of gratification and self-worth in being identified with that and being kind of the hero of the story.
Yeah, although I'd rather they be the hero of the story for a big thing that changed the world
Right.
than for the size of the foundation they established.
So we've mentioned Blue Meridian a few times. A lot of people in the audience probably don't know what Blue Meridian is, and I think it's a really interesting example because it's catering to a unique trend, a unique problem with American wealth right now. So imagine that you've accumulated so much wealth and that you've decided you don't want to put together a staff foundation like Larry oversees at Hewlett. Even though you have a relatively modest staff for what you give out, you still have an infrastructure. You have a building, you have a couple 150 people under the roof, probably 125. So that would be a pretty modest kind of operation compared to some of your peers. But let's say as a donor, and there are a group of donors, you've acquired so much wealth, you don't want to set up that kind of operation. And now you need these shovel-ready opportunities. I don't love that term, I have to say, but you need these, what you need is nonprofits who have a plan that they can immediately kind of begin giving you a sense of confidence that they could scale to meet the donation you're capable of giving them, right? So that's the shovel-ready idea. So there's donors in this country right now, just a staggering amount of them, who have accumulated so much that they need these shovel-ready opportunities to be able to move a lot of assets, philanthropic assets over, and kind of have someone else manage them, someone who kind of knows the business, where they don't have to build that infrastructure themselves. And Blue Meridian is really kind of an interesting experiment to do that. So can you kind of describe that and describe kind of what their objective is and how it kind of fits into this, this is like extreme big bets, right?
Yeah. And Larry is one of the partners of Blue Meridian, or Hewlett is. So he can add on for sure. But Blue Meridian is built with a group of generous and significant donors. It was founded by the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation, which has done some significant grant making in a number of youth development areas, with the idea of trying to give very significant funds, going up into 9-figure amounts, to social leaders that have a track record and evidence that can really move the needle in a powerful way on social problems. It's US focused, US disadvantaged youth. And so they're doing a lot of due diligence, a lot of planning support, and a lot of wisdom and advice to hopefully find some of these leaders out in the world that can do it. And they've given grants already in their first portfolio, which is public, to incredible organizations, whether it's Europe or Upstream or Youth Villages, which I mentioned, who really do have the potential to change the country.
And they've aggregated the money from high net worth donors who can give 100, 200, 300 million at a time. Is that right?
Yep.
So their biggest investors have moved,
Yep.
In one public announcement, 250 million
Yep.
into this fund. And then there's kind of a secondary group of investors that are at the $10 million plus level.
Well, there's more of a range. There's
Okay.
the general partners are 50 to 250, and then the limited partners are 10 to 5.
Okay, so they've structured it kind of with the parlance of a venture capital fund, even though they're doing all grants to 501c3 nonprofits. There's no impact investing in that. Is that right? So these are all zero return grants being given to organizations. Now you've just said that could hold up to 9-figure grants. That's like $1 billion.
Over a 10,
Not at once,
no,
over a 4 or 5 year period.
100 million plus.
Okay.
200,
Well,
yes.
Okay, so some of the grantees, so what has been announced in terms of those donors aggregate that money, then a team that has been established by a credible private foundation in New York has allocated their team to help these donors give that money to worthy youth development organizations, and what are some of the big bets? This was announced like a year ago,
Let me back
right?
up. So,
Okay.
so the idea, it's solving for 3 problems in a sense simultaneously.
Right.
The real heart of it was an experiment about scaling. So you had some number of organizations that there was a really lot of evidence that they had something that worked, and it's all, as we mentioned, youth focused, but that they had something that worked. And the question was, the grail in this is, can we scale this nationally? And it's like, well, let's try just a ton of money with, and what EMCF, Edna McConnell Clark, had done over the years, they were a version of venture philanthropy. They did it at different levels, startup, early stage, kind of mezzanine tier, but they would work closely with single organizations, a goodly amount of money, but also a whole lot of other support to help them learn how to use evidence and become more effective and efficient. So now the idea was, can we do that nationally? So that was the core problem they wanted to solve. Then a second issue was, you have these people who, as you say, don't really want to start their own foundations, but want to be able to give their money effectively. So here's a place where you can do it. And so they become the general partners, who are all $50 to $250 million, are actually the board, in effect, that is making the decisions about which organizations are going to get these big bets. And these are genuine big bets, right? And then Edna McConnell Clark is effectively their foundation. So they staff and do the things that EMCF has always done with the organizations to help them scale. And through that, then the third issue was, aggregating a really large pot of money that could be given out collectively in that way. Now, to me, we joined it as a limited partner because, for me at least, we had different interests. Faye and I, Faye Twerski back there, had slightly different interests. She was more interested in the aggregation aspects than I was. I was really interested in the scaling point. And the thing, and it's still too soon to tell, is what does it take to scale an organization, even one that has great evidence that it really works nationally? So it might be, this was my starting hypothesis, we'll see, it's too soon to tell, that if you have a cookie cutter kind of solution, it can scale. But that if it's a solution that, even though it works very much, really does depend a lot on the human resources and the particular leadership, it might not scale. And so far, it's still early, and there are strains where you can see it's hard to tell. Youth Villages is a good one. They've had some good successes and some real strains as they've moved out, and the people who made the thing work initially just can't be as involved in so many different places and so on. So that's...
Yeah, that's great. And to just give us a sense, since you started with Youth Villages, and Youth Villages is now a recipient of these Blue Meridian funds, what is the scale of what they're doing? Just give the audience a sense. They absorb all this capital, and they serve foster youth, and they're transforming the way that's done.
Yeah, so they're working with tens of thousands of youth a year. And what...
Over 13 states.
Over 13 states. And
the goal eventually is to have it everywhere where there are large populations of foster.
And the particular grant that's being, the particular goal that's behind the sort of new investment round, which by the way is phased, right? It's not all at once, is to actually address the issue of kids aging out of foster care. In this country, there's just over 20,000 kids a year that turn 18, have never been adopted or reunited with a family, and that age out, and that have some of the worst results of any population in the country. And Youth Villages has one of the only programs that shows evidence in changing the trajectory of those lives. And so the goal here is to actually get out to hit, hopefully, full penetration of offering around the country of those youth through, in this case, actually the innovation and what they're doing is through licensing. So as opposed to saying this one organization's got to be everywhere, they have this evidence-based program. Can they work and support and train the nonprofits that are in each community to do this work?
And so Larry had argued that if you were going to work on a big problem, in this case like foster youth, you would probably need to fund a constellation of organizations to address that problem. So are you betting on the fact that this one organization can significantly solve this problem? Or are there other things that they're also coordinating in terms of policy and advocacy for foster youth or other things?
And I think this actually gets to the heart of something important for us to address before we finish up. In this case, you're betting on a leader and an organization that is outside, not a staff member of Blue Meridian or Ed McConnell Clark, that has a plan to influence many other organizations and to influence policy. There's a certain amount of it that's on policy.
Through this licensing approach.
Through licensing is working with other nonprofits. They have advocacy that they work on aggressively in states and at the federal level otherwise. And I think that actually gets at the heart of it, because Larry, you said a little bit early in our conversation, a critique of sort of how we approach big bets is that everything traditional philanthropy could do would sum up or add up into a big bet. And one of the clear distinctions we have in what we're looking at is the moment when the philanthropist and the philanthropic professional cede control of the money. When does the center of gravity and responsibility go from the donating organization to the leaders in the field that are working on it? And a lot of traditional philanthropy has the philanthropic professional at the center for a long, long time, managing a lot of small grants, moving it, and that really the mastermind is on the donor side. And so what a lot of the big bets do, whether it's to one organization or to many organizations, is at some point in time they say, these are the groups that are getting the money, this is what's going to happen, this is a 5-year, a 10-year commitment to these organizations. So one of the conversations that I think gets brought up by big bets and that the nature of big betting encourages is when, and that was actually the genesis of the word bet, right? When does the person in control of the money cede control of the money to people or groups or initiatives that they believe in? And I think that a lot of nonprofit leaders would say, we're out of balance in the sector, that too much of the control is in the hands for too long of the people in the foundations, the donors themselves, versus now saying, so you can give a large amount of money, and in fact, someone is going to be managing it and refining and learning and developing over time, but that can also be the nonprofit leader.
So,
Before you go, let me just signal the audience. I'm going to turn to you in just a minute after this comment to get your comments and questions into this. So take a minute, get ready to raise your hand. Go.
So it provokes just a number of sort of related responses. So one is Youth Villages isn't solving the problem. It's improving outcomes to some extent along one dimension. And it doesn't really claim to solve. It's not even a problem to be solved, right? The solution to the problem would be to not have to have foster kids. But it is an improvement, and it's something that was good and can be scaled. And so my first point is actually the answer depends on the nature of the problem, and there's so many different kinds of problems to live with. So my objection to big bets is that may be a conclusion that you reach at the end, but the right way to think this through is to start with the problem, figure out what's the best way to make the kind of advance that you want to make, and then follow that there. That's why I'm not opposed to all big bets. I'm just opposed to setting it up as this is what really cool people in philanthropy do, which is what I think is the message that's getting sent.
Yeah.
Second, though, William's point is, of course, absolutely true. I just don't think it's related to whether it's a big bet or lots of small grants. That is to say, a good foundation understands that it's working in partnership with its grantees. It does not tell them what to do, but it is responsible, of course, for the use of its resources. And if you do this well, you actually should be able to contribute to what the grantees are doing. That would be good philanthropy. I think if you talk to the people in the Newark School District, right, they will tell you that, right, they did not feel like they had control, which is, that's an example perhaps of a bad big bet, but the point being that the size of the bet itself is independent of the way in which the philanthropist chooses to try and empower grantees, work with grantees, and enable them to do their best work. Right. One last point, though, it is easy for that to become a fetish on the other side. So now and it is still the case at the end of the day, I feel responsible for our resources. So, my team will do all their due diligence, we'll give up the money. It's not therefore then, like, we have to get out of the way and let them do whatever they want. That would actually not be responsible stewarding of our resources. We do have knowledge and perspective that they don't. As I said, that's why it's understanding where you reach a partnership and really maximizing what each partner has to bring to the achievement of what are hopefully mutual goals. Bad philanthropy is when you depart from those pieces and the goals aren't mutual, you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do, you're overly controlling, whatever those are. But that's a style for working with grantees and as opposed to, as I say, something that turns on how much money you're giving.
Great. Okay, we want to turn to you, and let's start. We'll start here with Bruce, 1, 2, and Paul, 3.
Should we have a mic?
Yeah, Bruce, you've got a mic right there. Yeah.
Okay. One of my favorite lines in all of philanthropy occurred in one of my, what I think is one of the greatest pieces written about philanthropy, and that's Michael Walzer's piece back in Dissent years ago. And the line is, the problem with the princely gift, which is kind of what you guys are talking about, is the power of princes. And I think that there is inevitably in this field, and I've been in a long time, a problem of a lack of a negative feedback loop. And it's kind of what you were speaking to at the end there, Larry. I mean, it is, foundations may say, or philanthropists may say, wow, we really value the input from the field. But in fact, there is incredible deference out there on the part of nonprofits to large amounts of money, and the larger the amount of money, the more the deference. And I was going to bring up Newark, I think, the Zuckerberg gift, 100 million turned into 200 million, and now what? What happened to it? And the Gates experiment with small schools. I mean, that happened a few years ago. Sure, there's a lot to be said about both of those, but fundamentally, they were pretty much problems because there was a lack of input from the very beginning from the field.
All right, great. Over here, you were next. Can we hand her a microphone?
Thank you. You had talked about some of the big bets being Chan Zuckerberg, you mentioned the Emerson Collective, and I've noticed that they're set up not as traditional foundations. So I'll leave it as an open question, like how does that play into being disruptive or in terms of being public about what they're doing? And do you think this is a trend? And if so, do you think it's a good one?
So what she's referring to is these new hybrid philanthropies that are making huge announcements, like Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan. They've set up an LLC to hold their philanthropic work, their impact investing, their advocacy and policy. And unlike a private foundation, there would be requirements around transparency, at least in the filing of your 990, if not a website or whatever. Not that they couldn't elect to do that, to have a Chan Zuckerberg Initiative website, and may do that, and they may already have one. I just haven't checked. There's this trend toward LLCs, these kind of new hybrid entities where typically extraordinarily wealthy families are setting them up so that they have a degree of flexibility in the way they're giving away their money and using multiple tools to affect change. So just that's the background on your question. And any thoughts on that?
So Larry, you should jump in too. There are a number of notable examples of that happening. I do think that there are a lot of philanthropists or wealthy individuals that want to create social change that say sometimes the right tool is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, sometimes it's a 501c4, sometimes it might be something that's for profit. Certainly social problems can be pulled on by different levers. I think the dynamics of what do you actually believe will create change, what kind of resources does it take, how do you know, are you in charge, are other people running with it, probably play out across all of those dimensions.
So I think I think trend is too strong. There's a couple of examples. When I think about this, I think there are three important decisions that you make when you think about philanthropy. One is, do you want to exist in perpetuity or not? Two is, do you want the benefit of the tax break or not? And three is, do you want the ability to do political stuff or not? And the forms you choose around that are based on those judgments. Had Zuckerberg not created an LLC, it would be exactly the same as when he did, right? Which is to say he just hasn't committed to what he's going to do with his philanthropic dollars. And for now, he's just giving it out and getting the tax break or not as he does it, depending on whether he gives to a 501c3 or in some political way. And of course, he's, 32 years old, right? So one of the other things is most of the people that we're talking about, they're brand new to philanthropy, and they'll learn. They're high profile in the press because they made their money so fast. But when I think of the Hewletts, although they did start the foundation in 1966, it was very small. They earned their wealth slowly over time, and they figured out philanthropy as they went along. I think they hired Roger Hines in 1977 because it was really at that point that they realized, oh, you know what, we want a professional foundation to do this. That was 11 years into the foundation and 30 years into their philanthropic careers. So I think it's like way too soon to be talking about, let's see what happens over time. But it's still, at the end of the day, is just those three decisions: perpetuity, tax break or not, and you make trade-offs for those, and political or not.
Well, and I would actually add one more to it that I think is at the center of everything and comes a little bit back to the conversation we're having, which is, do you view yourself as an investor or an operator? And there are operating foundations that design and build programs wonderfully. There are investors who get very good at picking great leaders to make change and figuring out how to coach and advise and support them. And then there are a lot of players that do some mix in between that can be thoughtful or muddled depending, on the giver.
And I would add impact investing to do.
Well, impact investing is a tool, but it works within any of those forms. So but it is similar. It's the tax break or not.
Right. And the Amidyar network, of course, is also an LLC structure. I mean, they're cropping up. I don't know if on the East Coast they're trending as much as they seem to be here.
So I will just say this whole
and
East
we'll go
Coast,
to
West
Paula's
Coast thing,
next.
this is not like rap. It's a little bit exaggerated.
All right.
That's what I told William. I have a piece in my computer now called Against Impact Investing.
Okay.
You guys will get that later.
So Paul Brest is here.
That's a trend.
Who's
Right,
Larry's predecessor and also the faculty director of Stanford Pack.
Larry's going to have a whole set of against series.
I'm going to do one against myself,
So
against curmudgeons.
I have a question for William, and drawing on Bruce's comment. I'm trying to figure out, and I read the SSIR article and the Forbes article, what there is besides the glorification of princes. And so it seems to me there are three possible criteria. Maybe there are more. One is, when you think about bet, and you use the word risk, we usually think a bet is something risky. But actually, a lot of the big bets are, what you call big bets, are in organizations that, for quite happily, are no longer very risky. So I don't understand. The only time you used risk here was the risk of your peers thinking that you should be, criticizing you for not getting to Stanford, but that's really not the risk that you're taking. So are they risky? Secondly, is there any criterion of their being evidence-based? A lot of the organizations on those lists seem to be doing work based on good evidence, but is that a criterion? And then finally, you mentioned at the very end that you think good philanthropy, which I certainly agree with, is one where the donor isn't constantly meddling, although sometimes the donor knows a lot. But when I look at the big bets list, I had not thought that kind of independence from donors and donors not meddling was a criterion for big bets.
Yeah.
So talk about risk, about evidence-based, and meddling or not as
Yep.
criteria.
So happy to talk about that. And I should point out that Paul is a board member of mine, Larry is a funder of our organization, and
Happily will continue.
and happily, and we hope with so many good opportunities, but for new research pieces. But one of the things that I'll just point out here is anything that gets some attention, like the term big bets, attracts concerns and worries and hopefully impact on both sides. But the conversation we've just had here for the last hour, Larry has expressed a concern about big bets encouraging disruptive, kind of magic bullet, quick fix, risky behavior. And Paul is now asking me, well, gosh, so many of the things on the list don't seem very risky and seem like big grants to established organizations. How much of a bet is going on here, right? So there are concerns on opposite sides of the spectrum.
Just a question of what the definition is.
Yeah. So we did not have a risk element in what we were ranking. We didn't say, gosh, if something seems more, as a follow-on grant to something, then it doesn't count. So we didn't have a risk criteria. On the other two dimensions, we did. So when we looked in the Forbes list for, again, the criteria that someone might, if we should be so lucky, try and maximize against, having a track record and evidence was one of the criteria. For all of our database, when we tried to do this very difficult part of the research, which is to say it's not all bets to a single organization, it's not all singular grants to one organization, it's grants to multiple organizations and the rest, what we tried to distinguish between were two very different things, but hard to draw the line between. One is a donor or foundation announces a new program area and says, I will spend $50 million over the next 10 years addressing X, obesity, refugees, you name it, with the actions yet to be determined, right? Over the next 10 years, we'll figure out great grants, we'll do good work, we'll help them think. We may even have some theories and theory of change of how it happens, but what we're going to do with our money, we'll figure out over the course of the 10 years. Versus things that were at a moment in time where the donor did seem to cede control, where the donor said, here is this initiative, here's the selection criteria for every city that will get a grant, for every coal plant that we're going to invest in trying to bring down. Or to say, here are the 5 grantees we're going to trust to execute this work. So that was, again, it is imperfect, but that's what we worked hard to try and draw. So when does the money leave? When has the commitment been made to the actors in the field?
All right, we'll do 1, 2. Oh, Faye, you've got the microphone. Okay, Faye's next.
She's tough.
1, and then 2 here, the lady in the stripes, and then 3, and then 4.
Okay, so I will be quick since there's a long line here. And because I see Larry every day, and I only see you occasionally, William, I have another question for you, which is, I feel like you haven't really contended with Larry's central critique of definitions of big bets in the Forbes article, which is, let's just take Hewlett as an example. So
Yeah.
I'll ask you to critique us. For a large strategic foundation, all of our giving areas are focused on solving problems. They're all over $10 million, well over, if you think about them over the course of a few years. But yet, they didn't all make the list. They didn't even all make the ancillary list. So give, what? None of them. Right. So then how do you reconcile the fact that you said, well, those 4 criteria that Larry laid out as characterizing our philanthropy, maybe other big foundation philanthropy too, but certainly our philanthropy, it doesn't make the list, and does that make you worry that there's something wrong with the methodology in the list? So how do you reconcile that central critique?
Yeah, so the reconciliation is what we were just talking about, which is about the ceding of control, right? It's when, it's not as their program area with the strategy, right? Where their program officers are making grants and evolving those grants and changing. It's when is there a moment where you say, for this sum of money, here's the set of actors we're going to rely upon to achieve a certain goal, and that's been done.
Well, no, because you include.
I'll just say one more follow-up
Yeah.
on that, Larry, I think, there, which is that I would say, knowing well how actually the Hewlett Foundation works and how Blue Meridian works, I wouldn't say that Blue Meridian is any less controlling than the Hewlett Foundation. That is, I think it's about the same amount of seriousness and diligence and conversation and partnership. Same amount of seriousness, diligence, conversation, and partnership that we have with our partners, for the most part, as Blue Meridian has with its partners. It's just a different style. And I'm a big fan of Blue Meridian. I just think it's a different style of a big bet, but it doesn't show up on the list. And that could raise a concern on, is this the only way to go, as opposed to solving social problem way to go, which might necessitate more different kinds of bets.
And so let me just come back and say, this is, first of all, it shouldn't be about Blue Meridian, and Blue Meridian is one approach, and by the way, it's quite a rare one, right? The notion of putting significant sums on singular organizations is rare. I think very exciting, but rare. The vast majority of the big bets that float to the top are to multiple grantees trying to do different things. But there is this moment in time where a decision is made against a set goal with a set group of actors to put the money to use outside the walls. And I actually think that it's not a small subject. I would say the number one topic I get emails from on this Big Bets work is from leaders of nonprofit organizations that say, thank you for writing about this, because what we find is that far too often the norms in philanthropy are that philanthropies have strategies with a certain amount of grants. And I'm not saying in any way that this is what Hewlett does, but that philanthropy controls the purse strings and keeps us as perpetual beggars. So even if we receive grants year after year after year from the same foundation, it's always contingent on the next thing, it's the next thing. And that the person in control and shaping the strategy, treating them like contractors, is the philanthropy. So again, and this is not to say that in fact, so this gets to the center of gravity point. The center of gravity can be in the philanthropy, it can be in the nonprofit leader out in the field, and different problems, I think, can be addressed in different way, in different sides of the equation. Some are one, some are the other. But on the whole, I think that there's a power dynamic here when the money is not sort of committed to an actor or set of actors in the field that's too often the norm.
Okay.
If the goal here, if philanthropy is to actually make improvements or to see changes in the social sector, they must always incorporate something related to government policy or funding. You mentioned in terms of youth villages, the biggest part was the government funding. In charter schools, the biggest income is still coming in from the various educational districts. So how do the big bets intersect with government in terms of both policies and practices in a very diverse country, the United States?
First, that's not essential. It is generally the case, mostly because the resources that government has dwarf those that we have. So if you, in the first half of the 20th century, actually, there was a lot more direct services because government wasn't doing very much, and the resources philanthropy had was capable. Now, at this point, it's leverage that you want, and so that's why so many of the philanthropic strategies are focused around advocacy to get government to do something. I don't think that cuts one way or the other. So I would not, for instance, describe youth villages as primarily about leveraging government resources. It actually is about an organization that gets set up that provides the services themselves according to a fixed plan. A lot of them are like that. Upstream USA, which is one of the other organizations. So I think there's just a mix, although the relative mix has more of them requiring advocacy from government because that's where the leverage is. And then again, I don't think that cuts one way or the other across the debate that we're having, which is it's still. So the reaction I have to what William said a minute ago is, of course, I agree completely, but it's a different debate. What should the relationship between funders and grantees be? And again, it has nothing to do with the size of the grants or even the size of the aspirations, whether big or small, whether single grantees or lots. It's bad philanthropy to treat them like contractors and push them to do things that aren't what they naturally do. It's bad. Is that better? Okay. And so on. So And that's true whether it's an advocacy grantee or a direct services grantee. So I guess what I would say is just, I don't think, well, I would say this, it's really hard to get government to do anything without, if $10 million is a measure, it's really hard to get government to do anything without investing a lot more than that.
Okay, over here.
Hi. We mentioned New York, and we mentioned like these big social issues like foster youth and education. We noticed a trend to a lot more money giving into private solutions to some of these big issues, and I am wondering first if you notice that being the case, that there's a trend to possibly find privately or nonprofit held solutions to big things that were usually given as government service or public rights, right? Like, let's say education, foster care. And if that is the case, and the answer is yes, I just wonder what your personal views are on, is this the right bet to have
Yeah,
these
so
be
more
privately sold?
making markets work through private investment. What's your take on that in terms of big bets and creating change? And you said you have something against impact investing. This
Yeah.
may be where,
Yeah, so we actually may agree a lot on that. I think there's a lot to impact investing, but I could write an against impact investing piece as well. But maybe we should
And then you could
talk
come
about
and agree on
but,
that.
But I guess in
That'd be our
terms of
next
in terms of the private solutions, I don't have any data to answer your question in a powerful way, other than to build on Larry's point and then add something, which is to say, essentially for human service type problems, government is by far the dominant funder, right? So if you're trying to address issues of poor youth, to not be influencing government policy is probably not a viable way to go. Now, there are other areas in terms of things like energy efficiency and the rest, where the private markets may be fully capable of handling what happens. So it depends on the area. But I guess what I would say where it does come, I think, connect to the debate we're having in these questions about risk, actually, is given how small philanthropy is as a proportion of the money going into the social sector, what is its role, right? And even if you look at nonprofit organizations themselves in human services, all charity, let alone big strategic philanthropy, is a small percent. And within charitable giving alone, foundations are a small percent. So, by some estimates of all charitable giving, you're really only talking about 5% or so that are really big, high net worth individuals writing checks, philanthropy, right? So any of the stuff we're talking about here, like a $10 million check, is a tiny percent of what charity does. So my question would be, how much should it in fact be? How much should that private money with a government tax subsidy be the risk capital of social change? How much should it be pushing the envelope?
So, and I'll come at this from a slightly different angle, which is, I'll take your question as privatization versus government solutions, because a lot of philanthropy is going to government to push government to privatize, right? Whether it's schools or prisons or so on. And then that's one kind of thing. And then there's impact investing, which is an effort to actually think we can solve these social problems by, unleashing the entrepreneurial energy of the private markets and so on. So for myself, I would say, one, I think I'm resolutely non-ideological around that. It depends on what the thing is. There clearly are cases where privatization might make sense. Two, I find it ironic to some extent that after a 30 or 40 year period of the solution to everything is private markets, government is bad, as the rest of the world is beginning to figure out that maybe that's not right. Philanthropy is discovering private markets as the way to solve social problems. Three, I'm skeptical about, most of the problems that we deal with, at least, are a product of market failures. So it seems to me unlikely that a market solution is going to be the answer unless the market failure is itself something where it's just that the market is being held back and you can unleash it. So energy is a really good example of that. We spent a lot of time investing in what are essentially microeconomic solutions to make renewables and clean energy cost competitive with fossil fuels, but now it's like, okay, they're there and let's let the market take over from here. And I don't think Trump can do a whole lot to stop that, and so there's an array of answers, except, as I say, there tend to many people to be a kind of background ideological assumption that, and schools are the best example where privatization has been a disaster, top to bottom. Not even charter schools or vouchers. It's more like, outsourcing all the extracurricular activity. This is Bob Putnam's thing, right? About all the social capital that used to be provided by the schools and now it's not, and people with money can provide it for their kids. My daughter gets music lessons and has sports, and poor kids don't get those opportunities. It makes you, so it's, again, as everything, case by case.
So here's my final question for the evening. So there's a lot of social entrepreneurs in the room. There's a lot of nonprofit leaders. There's a lot of people who sit on the boards of nonprofits. There's a lot of people studying the sector. And they're all wondering, how do I get my organization, from whatever vantage point I'm working in it, kind of shovel ready for these opportunities? So I'm going to turn the question around. If you want to be the recipient of a big bet, or you want to be part of a collective that's part of a big bet, what do you need to do to tee up that opportunity for this new wave of philanthropy and donors that are coming down the pike? I know in my practice, donors want shovel-ready opportunities. They're looking for what's out there that I can help scale and I can provide critical game-changing capital toward. So what's your advice? You're sitting thinking about all the groups you do due diligence on and the kind of criteria you apply, and you're in a practice at Bridgespan working with groups to develop the plans and the evidence to get ready for this scale and to kind of be able to absorb this capital. So just give the audience a sense of, from your perspectives, like what is the checklist of things that you think are critical for these organizations to be focused on so they can be on the list?
I don't know how to, that's a hard question the answer I want to give is probably going to be satisfying to nobody. But I think I want to give the same answer that I would start with for the funders, right? Which is the first criterion for funders is do what you believe in. And I would say the same. So what is the issue that you want to do? How do you want to do? When I was dean at the law school, when we were fundraising for different centers, it would be like if we can't raise money there's actually a lot more. You can criticize the pluralism of the donor community, but there's a fair amount of pluralism out there. There's a lot of donors, a lot of hooks that you can put out into the water. And if you can't get anyone to bite, then maybe there's something wrong with the idea. And so you're not going to help yourself by not doing what you think is right or doing it the way you think is right and just getting money. That's what produces bad organizations. We do too much to try and keep them all in business forever, as do they. My dad was in the restaurant business. You get used to going out of business because that's what happens. So honestly, what I want to say is pitch your idea, think it through, get your evidence for why it'll accomplish something, and then go find a funder who that is what they think they should support. If there is a problem, I don't think it's on that side. It's really hard to know what most funders will support. Even ours, you go on our website, it's really hard to actually know what our strategies are in enough detail to know if your particular take on something is something that we want. But I wouldn't say, I still want to say, it should be your take. Figure out what you think is the problem and how you think it should be solved, and see if you can raise money for that. And if you can't, then you should rethink what you're doing.
So I do have one sort of core thought on this, and it's a great question because it comes to what does it take to get more, and Larry and I agree on a lot in terms of what makes good philanthropy and what are some of the criteria for something that will create change in the world effectively. I worry less, I think, than Larry that this big bet focus is going to encourage people to become obsessed with disruptive and new and move their money in thoughtless ways. My experience is actually the opposite, that the bigger the check someone's contemplating writing, and by the way, there are exceptions one could find, but the bigger the check, the more thoughtful they are, and the more willing they are to invest in being thoughtful about it. Only in giving to sort of institutions of higher education and cultural institutions do I think people write big checks without that much planning or thought. But when it comes to these tough social problems, people spend a lot of time.
David Kennedy just blanched white out there.
Look, it's true, and I'm not saying. Look, I think it's one of the pillars of American society and our nation. But it's easier to get money if you're Stanford or Harvard than if you're trying to work on homelessness. But the gap that I see, right, because I actually think donors have really high hurdles about giving significant money, is not the charismatic leader, right? There's plenty of charismatic leaders, and you can't charisma yourself into, a $100 million donation, right? And it's not the importance of the problem, right? It's, there are many problems worthy of a life's work to solve in our country, unfortunately. and I think that will continue for a long time. What actually seems most to be missing, and we do sourcing and diligence work for a lot of these donors, and the place where you see it fall apart all the time is not that the leader's great, it's not that the problem does not have merit and worthy of being addressed in some material way. The problem is actually having a realistic path to get from where you are to what you say needs to be addressed. And the behavior that I would see as most common among nonprofits that gets in the way is that they sell the problem, right? So if you want to talk about climate change and how devastating it will be if the Earth increases by more than 2 degrees centigrade, you can get people to believe that, and that will be high on someone's list of a problem worthy of being solved. But there are very few nonprofit entities that can make a meaningful dent on that, and the harder you sell the problem, the farther it seems like what you're offering can actually move the needle. So it's being able to put a realistic, what we would call arrival point, something that you can make a change in that's worthy enough from being solved, and then paint how whatever it is you do gets there. That seems to be the gap that's missing. And when nonprofits then instead talk about how even bigger and bigger the problem is than you realize it is, they get farther and farther away from having some realistic path to addressing what they've just made you all worried about.
Excellent. All right, so thank you so much. I want to turn it over to Kim for some closing remarks. Thank you for all your questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them.
Great. Thank you all. Are we on? We on? Thank you, Larry. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Lots to think about related to when are big bets the right bets, scaling the problem, defining the problem, and many different approaches to solving the problem. So I want to thank all of you. I'd also like, when we think about scaling and scaling solutions, if you look inside your program tonight, you will see that our next event is June 5th, and it's called Rethinking Innovation and Scale. It is with 2 of our Stanford PACS affiliated scholars, Johanna Mayer, who is our academic editor for SSIR, and her research partner, Christian Silos. It features their new book, Innovation and Scaling for Social Impact. So we hope you can join us on June 5th for that. In the meantime, though, please join me in thanking William, Larry, and Alexa.